everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent. How wonderful to be here. My name is Kirsten Campbell and I'm the Interim Chief Operating Officer here at the University. I've been here for about 2 months, absolutely loving it, working with the most amazing people. I had no idea about this either, and Andy was talking about it and what an amazing series of events to participate in. I'm so delighted to be invited to come along, and the additional honour to welcome you all to this, the first in-person event. I'm so thrilled just to be part of this, and I'm so delighted you could all come along to be part of the University of Dundee's ongoing Founders Project and hear so much more about it. Many of you will know this important initiative began in 2021 as part of a broader effort to explore the legacies of slavery and empire in Dundee and indeed across Scotland. The Founders Project seeks to examine the early benefactors and founders of the university, investigating their connections to colonialism and slavery. In its first phase, we're really fortunate to have Dr. Cassandra Gupta, a postdoctorate researcher, lead the work. Her report focused on University College Dundee and in particular the founding endowment from the Baxter family. Thanks to the support of the Scottish Graduate School for Arts and Humanities, we're now in phase 2 of the project. PhD researcher Erin Hancock, who we will shortly hear from, is continuing this vital work, expanding the scope to include other early benefactors of University College Dundee, as well as the founding figures of institutions that later became part of the university, such as Duncan of Jordanstone College of Art, Dundee College of Nursing, and the School of Medicine. This evening, we are absolutely delighted to hear from Erin, alongside University Archivist Caroline Brown and Museum Curator Matthew Jarron. Together, they'll share insights into the university's transatlantic connections with the Americas and the Caribbean. Looking ahead, we are really excited to announce a future event being planned in collaboration with staff at Verdant Works, which looks for connections to South Asia. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I am sure you will find the presentations both thought-provoking and inspiring. Thank you all.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andy Mohan. I am the Race Equality Charter Lead for the University of Dundee. And I'm so proud of the university's commitment to advancing race equality by signing up to the Race Equality Charter, which we have a Bronze Award for. So one of the key actions from the Race Equality Action Plan is that we would grow our Black History Month program, but we will also host other race equality events across the year, and this is what we have been doing. So I would like everyone, so after this you'll see a slideshow of other events that are happening, so please do check them out, as well as on our website, and sign up to any that interests you. In May this year, we had a conversation cafe that focused on the Founders Report Part 1 and why this is important. And some of the attendees were from countries that were colonized. Some of us were the ancestors of slave people, and some of us were members of staff who were directly responsible for supporting students who fall either into those two groups. And we talked about the complexity, about how we feel about our identities, and why we chose to come to the UK and to the University of Dundee. And this really revealed the very close links that the UK and the university share with many countries, and how understanding the past is crucial to understanding and celebrating these links. And this Thursday, we have another Conversations Cafe that's going to be following up on that discussion. So I'm pleased that the part 2 of this project was able to go ahead. Before you leave, we have a very short feedback form for this event if you would like to fill that out. But I'd like to now hand over to Erin to present the findings of part 2.
Hello, my My name is Erin Hancock. I am the current Founders Project Phase 2 intern. It's been a real privilege to come into this project and get to continue the work of Dr. Guptar and to get to work on this incredibly important topic. So I'm going to first take you all through a quick overview of the topics we're going to cover today. Those are going to include a couple key terms that will pop up multiple times throughout this overview. Those may include terms that y'all already are familiar with. I know that jute is something that is really widely known here, but we are also going to look at figures covered in the previous Founders Project. Baxter, Sir David Baxter, and the company they were associated with, along with George Armitstead, who is also covered during this project. We'll then delve into the life work of James Duncan of Jordanstone, Sarah Gilroy's family associations, Helen Symers associations with the British Linen Company, and then connections to Malvina Wells, the kind of main woman we know about who was born enslaved and who died and is buried in Edinburgh, who has connections to the British Linen Company. Finally, we will end with James Martin White, another figure we're kind of continually exploring and where we are looking for this to go next. So the two main terms you need to know are Osnaburg linen, an image of which you see on your left. It was the cornerstone of Dundee's textile industry from the mid-1700s through at least the 1860s, which is kind of when Dundee started switching more towards jute. It was called the poorest and meanest of all linens, and formerly enslaved people remarked repeatedly on its roughness and the pain of wearing it. It was chosen by enslavers as the main material for enslaved people's clothing because it was incredibly cheap to produce and cheap to ship. It created the foundation of Dundee's textile industry, and the methods and material production types were used for jute as well in following years. It's also worth noting that even after the UK abolished slavery, Dundee in particular continued to trade Osnaburg linen and jute with countries that were still actively enslaving people, most notably Brazil, and this continued until at least 1880. We also need to understand jute is a fiber produced from hemp. Much of the raw material for that was imported from India. It is also used to make roughly spun practical cloth for bags and other materials. And I'm going to hand it over to Caroline to talk about the Baxters.
Thanks, Erin. So I'm Caroline Brown. I'm the University Archivist, for those of you who don't know, and I'm just briefly going to run through some of the things that were found in the first Founders Report, in case you're not familiar with it, and look at some of the Baxter family. Most of you will know this lady right on top of me is Mary Ann Baxter, who in 1881 gave £130,000 to found University College Dundee, with her kind of distant cousin John Boyd Baxter giving £20,000. And it's Mary Ann Baxter who famously said that people of any religion could join the university. People weren't to be asked what their religion was, and also, most importantly, said that all classes were to be open to men and women equally, and that's probably the first time that happened in the UK. So at this time, at the end of the 19th century, Dundee was an international city with some of the largest textile factories in the world, and its jute and linen products were spread across the world. Raw material came from the Baltics, jute came from India, and of course regular imports came from their trading partners, and related industries such as shipbuilding and whaling and even polar exploration strengthened Dundee's role as a maritime hub. So this kind of global significance is well known in Dundee's history in the 19th century, but as Erin's mentioned, it actually started at least a century earlier with this Dundee Osnaburg, and the plantations in the Caribbean and US and South America all proved really profitable markets for Dundee linens. Osnaburgs produced in Dundee were usually exported via West Coast ports such as Glasgow and Liverpool, but as demand increased, direct sailings from Dundee itself became more common, and from 1753 ships travelled regularly from Dundee to Jamaica, returning with goods such as coffee and rum and molasses, produced obviously by enslaved labour. So this was the context in which Mary Ann Baxter's father, William Baxter, from a family in Angus, he decided to erect a small spinning mill in Glamis in 1806, and soon many of his children, he had loads of children, and I'm not going to list them all, but many of his children joined the family business, and a larger mill was built on Dens Burn in Dundee, with the firm becoming known as Baxter Brothers, headed by one of William's sons, David Baxter. And at its height, Baxter Brothers was deemed the largest linen factory in the world. Its products made up a large proportion of the linen exported from Dundee to countries across the world. And in 1832, it's estimated that this amounted to the equivalent of over £56 million worth of trade. And given the firm's centrality to this trade, a large part of this money went to the Baxters. So the company traded with or invested in multiple other businesses, many of which had links with transatlantic slavery. For example, David accumulated wealth in investments in Turnbull & Co., who acted as agents selling goods to countries like the US, Brazil, Venezuela, Colombia, British Guyana and Jamaica. And some of these goods would have been Osnaburgs to clothe slaves. And David was also involved in another area of slave economy, sugar refining. He served as the manager of Dundee Sugar House for a period, and this venture wasn't particularly successful. He probably didn't make very much money from it. He didn't actually need to make very much money from it because at the time of his death in 1872, his property was valued at around £110 million, which only 20,000 went towards establishing a mechanics institute in Dundee. And some of you will probably realise that the Mechanics Institute became the Dundee Technical Institute in 1888, which eventually went on to become Abertay University, and a part of it went on to become Duncan of Jordanstone College of Art and Design. So Mary Ann was the lucky one of all the siblings. She survived, so she inherited all this wealth from her father, from some of her siblings. And she had shares in various other companies that had connections with transatlantic slavery, such as DP&L, the British Linen Company that we'll hear about. And she had other connections as well. She was very philanthropic. She was involved in missionary work in Central Africa, India, China. And she even supported purchasing a steamer, which she named Ellen Gowan, to take missionaries to New Guinea. And there was a river named the Baxter River after her in New Guinea. So this kind of colonialism went obviously around the world, and the Baxters, in terms of Dundee, were at the heart of it. But we're lucky because in this spirit of philanthropy, she gave the money that had been accumulated by her family to found this university, which welcomed its first students in 1883, the year before she died. So I'll pass you on to Matthew now.
Okay, so another of the very early benefactors of University College Dundee is this gentleman here, George Armitstead. He donated £2,500 when the college first opened in 1883, establishing bursaries for students, which I believe are still awarded to this day. And in return, he was made a life governor of the college. And like the Baxters, Armitstead's wealth helped to fund many other enterprises in Dundee, as well as the university. Perhaps most famously, the Armitstead Lecture Series, which I'm sure many of you here will recall, which was established in 1887 and survived right up until COVID. But he also supported the Albert Institute, now the McManus, Dundee Royal Infirmary, Dundee Sailors' Home, the Kern Night Refuge, the Dundee Boys and Girls Religious Association, and many, many others. Now, Armitstead was actually born in Riga, what's now Latvia, then part of the Russian Empire, and it was there that his father formed a flax trading company called Armitstead & Co. Dundee's booming flax industry inevitably led to connections with that company, and in 1848, the 24-year-old Armitstead moved to Dundee to commence business here. It was also that year that he, very cannily, married into the Baxter family, his wife being the niece of David and Mary Ann Baxter. As such, he later became a major beneficiary in David Baxter's will. George Armitstead and Company acted as flax suppliers and commission agents for Baxter Brothers, thereby benefiting from their transatlantic business. But Armitstead also had other commercial interests, and one that's of particular interest to us was the money that he made as an importer of guano from Peru. And although this industry, at least in terms of its connections to Dundee, has now been almost entirely forgotten, it was actually a significant part of Dundee's maritime trade. According to one report in the Evening Telegraph, the ships bringing this pungent but necessary commodity were the largest using the Tay until the development of the jute trade. Now, guano comes from a Quechua word meaning malodorous commodity, and for anyone that doesn't know, it's basically the excrement of seabirds. Because it was particularly rich in nitrates, it was collected in large quantities to be used as fertiliser. It was mainly gathered from the Chincha Islands off Peru and developed into an international trade in the 1840s. The main markets were the US, Britain and France, and needless to say, they didn't much care about who was actually doing the extremely unpleasant job of harvesting and processing the product. Until 1853, enslaved people were still put to work gathering guano, later replaced by indentured labourers brought over from China. Over 100,000 Chinese workers were brought to Peru between 1849 and 1874, and it was only their ruthless exploitation that enabled the outlawing of slavery in Peru in 1854. And these workers were basically treated little better than slaves. Many were tricked or coerced into signing up or even kidnapped. They were effectively prisoners on the Chincha Islands and were treated appallingly. It was reported that labourers who did not load 5 tons of bird faeces per day, 7 days per week, were whipped. Apart from the guano industry's direct use of enslaved and indentured labour, it was also the main fertiliser used for cotton plantations in southern US states, and was thus supporting another industry dependent on slavery and exploitation. And Armitstead was just one of many who made large profits out of this extremely unpleasant business. Another of Armitstead's interests was in shipping. He commissioned and owned various vessels for his trading activities, and thus played an important role in developing Dundee's shipbuilding industry. While many of his ships were bringing flax to Dundee from the Baltic, he also owned a number of vessels that were used for transatlantic trade. Armitstead also made money by hiring his ships out to other firms, resulting in a complex network of global trade. One example is his ship, the Eva, which was chartered in 1861 by the Shanghai-based Denton Company, one of the major traders in opium. They were founded by George Baring, whose initial wealth came from the merchant bank Baring Brothers, founded by his father, which regularly invested in or lent money to slave owners in the Caribbean. So let's come on to our next benefactor, and this is someone whose name is very well known, but whose career we've previously known very little about. This is James Duncan of Jordanstone, who was born the year after Armitstead in 1825. On his death in 1909, he bequeathed the residue of his estate, which amounted to some £60,000, to found a School of Industrial Arts in Dundee, to be named and known in all time to come as the Duncan of Jordanstone Art School. His bequest came completely out of the blue, with Duncan having shown no interest at all in art in Dundee during his lifetime. He had purchased the Jordanstone estate near Alyth in 1892, having already acquired the estates of Drumthorpe and the Forest of Alyth, and lived there until his death. Now, Duncan's bequest caused considerable problems. He'd made his will in 1899 at a time when there were multiple small art schools operating in the city. But in 1901, a nationwide reorganisation of art and technical education led to most of these being closed down or amalgamated, and art education in Scotland being restricted to 4 central institutions, one in each of the 4 cities. In Dundee, it was the Technical Institute in Smalls Wynd that was chosen, having taught art classes since it opened in 1888. So they were really the only possible recipients of Duncan's bequest, but in his will, Duncan had specified that his art school should be independent of the Technical Institute. That led to nearly 25 years of legal wrangling before it was eventually decided by an independent body of endowment commissioners that the Technical College would receive the bequest, but would have to establish a separate art college on a different site with its own principal and managing committee. The war and various other problems further delayed matters, and it was only finally in 1953 that work started on what is now the Crawford Building for the eventually renamed Duncan of Jordanstone College of Art. So that side of things is all very well documented, including in my own book of Art in Dundee, blatant plug. But what we didn't know was exactly how Duncan made his money. The stories told by later members of the Duncan family focused on cattle trading in South America. But thanks to Erin's research, we now know that that was just one of his various transatlantic business interests. There are still, however, some frustrating gaps, and there don't seem to be any written descriptions of Duncan's early days in business. Thankfully, we do have a detailed description of his brother David's entry into the world of commerce, from which we know that both James and David were sent to Chile, thanks to funding from a wealthy uncle, who was a linen merchant with ties to a chap called Stephen Williamson of a company called Balfour Williamson & Co. Now, we know that many of their records were destroyed in the 1909 Valparaiso earthquake, so that could explain the lack of documentation about James Duncan's early life and work. However, by following Brother David's path and linking that to other sources, a broad outline of James Duncan's early work and investments can be made. So we know that David went to work for Balfour Williamson and Company, and that company, and particularly Stephen Williamson, who also gave money to the university, were investigated in the first phase of the Founders Project. In particular, they also invested in the nitrate and guano trade, as well as in a sheep plantation on the island of Rapa Nui, which you'll perhaps be more familiar with under its colonial name of Easter Island. The sheep plantation involved the forced removal of indigenous Rapa Nui people from their traditional lands into a single, heavily controlled settlement. The guano trade I've already talked about, but it's worth noting that the companies who managed the guano labour force in both Peru and Chile regularly conducted slave raids on Rapa Nui, often specifically targeting priests and other holders of cultural knowledge. While some of the enslaved Rapa Nui people were later returned to the island, those removals directly caused the loss of any ability to read or write in Rapa Nui script. David Duncan later established his own company, Duncan Fox & Co., which invested in cattle and sheep plantations in Tierra del Fuego in Chile. The implementation of this business plan included the forced removal, killing and torture of the Selknam people indigenous to the area. In 2003, this was officially acknowledged as genocide by the Chilean government. It's likely that James Duncan maintained ties to his brother's company and may well have worked for them before founding his own merchant company. At the very least, the family connections will have contributed to his own profit. So it seems almost certain that he will have benefited from this act of genocide. Later in his life, Duncan appears to have focused more exclusively on trade between Dundee and the United States. And we know that he was also importing goods from India. For several decades, he served as a member of the board of directors for the Tay Jute Works. And there are multiple references in the company's papers of Duncan's travels back and forth between Dundee and New York. The Tay Jute Works was owned by the Gilroy family, which neatly leads into the next benefactor we're going to look at, and I'll hand over to Caroline to tell you more about her.
Right, I'm not going to be here very long for this one because we're going to talk about Sarah Gilroy. I guess the kind of history of the precursor institutions that became the University of Dundee are very complicated. But if one woman could be said to have helped to found the College of Nursing, what is now Health Sciences, it's possibly Sarah White Gilroy. Because she's a woman, there is even less information about her than a lot of the other people that we've been talking about. And in fact, Erin has spent ages staring at the fact that she's a lich and wondering what that tells us in terms of historical evidence. But we do know some things. So and she was also born in 1825, the same date as James Duncan. She was the wife of a man called George Gilroy of Castleroy in Broughty Ferry. And the family firm of Gilroy Brothers were manufacturers of jute goods and cloth, and they became ship owners to further their extensive support and import trade with South America and Calcutta. Sarah's father as well, James Reed, was a linen weaver, and his life as a linen weaver coincided with the years when Dundee was the primary exporter of Osnaburg linens to plantations, as we've heard. And James, her father, is recorded as collaborating with a J. Gilroy, likely Sarah's future father-in-law, to ship goods to Savannah, Georgia. And Savannah was a primary port supplying cotton and tobacco plantations in the American South, as well as a port through which enslaved people were trafficked. So this shows a direct relationship with the American chattel's slavery, and Sarah's early life obviously benefited greatly and directly from profits made by exploiting these connections. So Gilroy Brothers, into which she married, was established in 1849 by Robert Alexander and George Gilroy. They were primarily jute manufacturers, which obviously has connections with India, but they were also kind of pioneers in various ways, not just in terms of importing raw jute from Calcutta, but also owning their own shipping. They operated the significant Tay Works on Lockheed Road, and they produced Hesselaps and floor cloths. And like many Dundee firms, they had direct links with transatlantic trade. One Gilroy brother, Robert, appears in the 1834 to 1835 Dundee American consular records as regularly shipping bushels of linen to American ports, including Charleston, South Carolina, and again Georgia. And the Gilroy brothers owned and operated 9 ships, as I said, beginning in the 1850s, some of which remained active through to the end of the 19th century. And one of these was named George Gilroy, so imagine naming your ship after yourself. But George actually sadly died, and when that happened, Sarah seems to have come into her own. She seems to have managed much as the family's role in the company following her husband's death. She served as the manager of her husband's remaining company shares, and she had her own shares in the company. So I guess in this way she reflects kind of what we know about Dundee women, that were pretty strong and pretty acute in terms of business. They participated in this idea of empire. She was a wife, she married well, she made sure her children married well, she managed a wealthy house, but when needed she stepped up and she managed the business as well. And like many whose wealth came from international trade, she was very interested in philanthropy. So one of her concerns was for the welfare of nurses, and this led her to provide donations to support the building of a home for nurses in the grounds of Dundee Royal Infirmary. The Gilroy Home, as it was called, opened in 1892, and this portrait was hung inside it. And this was the first home that enabled full-time nurses to train and work next to the hospital. So we can see that Gilroy Home was the foundation of health sciences. And this is a little plaque that says that the home was erected by donations from Mrs. George Gilroy in memory of her husband. So I'll now pass you back on to Erin.
All right. So the next figure we have to talk about is Helen Symers. So Helen Symers also kind of comes from that same world of upper-class Dundonian women. She was born to a wealthy family. Her father was Colin Symers, who was for many years the primary agent of the British Linen Company, later the British Linen Bank, in Dundee. After her father passed, she managed the household for herself and her mother. She appears in records of many different philanthropic efforts. She was recognized as a, part of my pronunciation, Burgess of Dundee in 1899 for that support of those causes. This included the endowment of a chair at the university and also the purchase of Ellen Bank as a common space for both university and city. So to cover where her money comes from, we really need to look at her father's life and work. What we do have comes primarily from newspaper records following his death. And so to look at that work, we also need to look at the British Linen Company, the seal of which you can see here. It is the figure of the goddess Pallas, who is the goddess of weaving and also of wisdom. She has a number of different materials related to specifically the linen and Osnaburg trade held in her hands. In her, I believe that's her right, there's the shuttle for a loom, and in her left there is the warp chain for a new cloth. Basically, it's what's used to transfer strands of linen from the warping board to the actual loom. And in her, kind of behind her, you can see a sailing ship. So it is deeply, it's obvious that the British Linen Company is aware of the importance of shipping and the importance of international trade, and specifically trade with those continually enslaving people in the Americas and the Caribbean as kind of the cornerstone of their wealth. So also the word above her you can see is detat, which I have seen translated as she enriches. So this is very explicitly a reference to flax and Osnaburg linen enriching Scottish merchants and Scottish bankers. The British Linen Company was founded just after the 1745 rebellion. In Scotland, it was named the British Linen Company because of fears that naming it the Scottish Linen Company would associate it with the 1745 rebellion. And in fact, one of the founders was, I think, almost captured by the Jacobites during the attack on Edinburgh. So there were two founders who then applied to the nobility and to other sources of funding. It took them a while to get the linen company started, but once they did, they essentially funded and managed the funding for almost the entirety of the Scottish linen industry, the main part of which is Osnaburg linen, so direct trade with plantations in multiple spaces. They also had significant investments in plantations, notably in Granada. So William Todd, one of the two founders, was a joint owner of the Dumfries plantation, named for the location in Scotland, which is the tie to our next figure. And again, it is from the documentation and from Helen Symers' own kind of financial records, it is clear that her primary source of wealth was directly from the British Linen Company and investments her father made during the height of trade with and investment in systems of enslavement in Dundee. So the figure we know the most about in terms of an enslaved person who was directly linked to these systems and whose story we have, and also whose portraits we have, which is incredibly exciting in terms of actually getting to see her face, actually getting to know something about her beyond kind of records left by her enslavers and later her employers. So Malvina Wells, who appears on the right of each of these paintings. She was born in Granada. She first appears in slave records in 1817 as the daughter of Thomas Wells, a white Scottish planter, and an unnamed enslaved mother. We do not know much about her mother. Her mother is not even named in her death certificate in Scotland. But what we do know about the life of Malvina is that she was likely bought by the McLeans, who were then running the Dumfries plantation, owned by William Todd, one of the founders of the British Linen Company and a continual investor in its wealth. So she was, this painting we have of her is just before she and the McLean family emigrated to Scotland. It is unlikely that she had much agency or much choice in this emigration. She is remembered by the descendants of this family. This is part of why we have so many records about her, as well as descendants of other people associated with the Dumfries plantation. So those two young girls were her charges. She served as nurse and nanny to them. And then she appears again in this 1830 portrait painted in Scotland with the same two girls. She was relatively well known for her painting ability. She also actually appears as the independent household owner in, I believe, 1861. Yes, 1861, she appears as an independent owner and landlord in the city of Edinburgh. So while she didn't have much choice in terms of the way she came to Scotland, she built her own life here within that deeply circumscribed kind of range of options available to her. She cared for, over the term of her life, about 3 generations of the MacLean family, the daughter Joanna and then Joanna's children. So despite her living independently in 1861, she appears again in 1871 on the census as a domestic servant. At one point, she was Joanna's lady's maid, which is a position of significant power and trust within the family. But again, how much choice and how much ability to move through the world she had within these areas is kind of unclear. We do actually have a painting she made of Scotland. It's incredibly exciting in terms of being a formerly enslaved person's view of the colonial center. We don't have any of her words, but we do have this painting. It's a watercolor of a location in the Highlands, and it felt important to include this, as so much of the history we do have is of the colonial center looking at marginalized and areas that they were systematically exploiting. This is Malvina's view of Scotland. Again, how she felt about moving to Scotland, we don't really know. We do know that she left significant funds to both her sister, still in Granada, but also to descendants of the MacLean family. And one of her charges, Joanna, ended up opting to be buried next to Malvina in an Edinburgh cemetery. Descendants of the family, including Frances MacDonald, have noted that, again, it is clear that Malvina actively made a life for herself in Scotland and actively exercised a large amount of agency, or what agency she could within a system weighted against her, and left us with, I am biased, but some pretty beautiful artwork. And again, a rare view of Scotland through someone from Granada's eyes during that era. So to move on to kind of what we're looking at to continue this work. So the gentleman on the left here is James Martin White. He was born in New York City to Scottish parents. His father settled in New York to establish James F. White & Co., a textiles trading company focusing on the import and export of Scottish and Irish textiles. In terms of what we know about that industry and his connections to Dundee, it is likely that a large amount of those were Osnaburg linen and the associated goods from plantations, including cotton and sugar. So also following the outbreak of the American Civil War, during which the question of whether enslaved people in the American South would continue to be enslaved, the White family left the States, never to return. However, the trade relationships were actively maintained by James Martin White, who also funded the chair of botany at Dundee, had a close relationship with Patrick Geddes, who is noted as a founder of the discipline of sociology, and James Merton White was also deeply invested in the pipe organ to the point where it pops up in a number of newspapers. He was apparently a player himself as well, but I am particularly interested in his kind of work life and his investments because I believe it will be a good way of looking at the kind of continuing systems of oppression, particularly in the American South, with Jim Crow, systems of sharecropping, and other systems that continued to exploit formerly enslaved people and their descendants. So we also have the Osnaburg linen panel of the Dundee tapestry, which is, in my opinion, a really interesting and meaningful reflection from a more recent time period on the role of Osnaburg linen. It includes figures like Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington is who was quoted talking about the pain of wearing Osnaburg linen. Both significant Black American thinkers, writers, and advocates for the freedom of the descendants of formerly enslaved people across the world. And so I would like to end with that image. Thank you so much for your time.
So I would like to thank Erin, Matthew, and Caroline. Please join me in thanking them for their And thank you so much for everyone who came out today. I hope you enjoyed it. Please do take time to fill out the feedback form, and if you have any further questions, I think the team will probably be here for the next few minutes as well. So thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day.